right, here we go. This is La Neta. This is about breaking down truths. We do this every single week. We take a certain issue and we break it down through a lesson, and then we look at a story. And through this, we try and get down to La Neta, the truth of the matter. We lay the facts on the table and we try and understand the issue at hand. This week, the issue at hand is mass deportation. In the United States today, more people are being deported than ever before in history. And that is, in fact, why I have former President Barack Obama here with me. Under Barack Obama, under the 8 years that he served from 2009 until 2016, more people were deported than ever in U.S. history. And that is true of George W. Bush. It's also true of Donald Trump. When we look at Barack Obama, he was the deporter-in-chief. More people were deported under Obama than under any other president. And that trend has kept up under President Trump, and that trend began in the 1990s. So we're going to look at this issue because the people that are being affected by this are people like this young girl that you see up on the screen right now. This is a 2-year-old girl who is crying because her mother is being separated from her. This was an image that was then later depicted on Time magazine, but is an image that is reflective of the situation in the United States today. Individuals are being deported in record numbers, and families, as a result, are being disrupted at record numbers in the United States. This is an issue that indirectly affects all of us and directly affects many of us. So let's get right down to it and start looking at the history of mass deportation in the United States. The land border between the United States and Mexico is 1,954 miles long. But that land border has not always been protected as it is today. In the 1920s, the Border Patrol was founded. Prior to that, there wasn't a Border Patrol. In fact, people could come and go as they pleased. And really, between the 1920s and the 1990s, people could do the same. Most people could freely come in and out of the United States by circulating through desert areas in surrounding cities like El Paso or Tijuana on the Mexican side, or Brownsville, Texas. And it was fairly easy to circulate in and out of Mexico and the United States as a result of how open the border was. Now, here to remind us of this historic fact is Mexican actor Mario Moreno, who is professionally known as Cantinflas.
¡Hey, mister!
Yes.
Pero, hombre, ¿qué están sordos que no oyen? Ahí estoy tocando toque y toque como si fuera badajo y ni quien se acomida a venir a ver qué se ofrece. ¿Que para eso les pagan? ¿Así se recibe al turismo de primera clase?
¿Qué desea?
Hablar con el jefe.
Yo soy el jefe.
Sí, pues no lo parece. Además, no me grites y todavía no estoy en sus terrenos. Todavía no pasa uno y luego tratan de subajar al individuo.
Bueno, ¿qué quiere?
Es como que quiero pasar al over there, al other side, you know?
Deportations from the United States are relatively low throughout most of U.S. history. But beginning in the 20th century, with the Great Depression, the United States and the Border Patrol that was created in the 1920s started to place more emphasis on removing people from the United States. Now that ended in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s with the founding of the Bracero program, which brought people in legally through the United States Government Agricultural Working Program. But after 1964, illegality continued to grow, and the deportation of immigrants also grew. But it didn't really begin to spike until 1996, when the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act was passed under Bill Clinton. That act, the Immigration Act of 1996, fundamentally changes the history of deportations in the United States, as we can see in this chart here. But after 1996, you see this massive spike. And that spike goes up even more after 2001, when the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, Immigration Control and Enforcement, were founded under the Homeland Security Act of 2002. So another way of thinking about this is, through immigration reform and through the founding of the Department of Homeland Security, the way in which we think about citizens and non-citizens in the United States has fundamentally shifted. 1996, with the Immigration Act, marks part of that shift. But 2002, with the founding of the Homeland Security, fundamentally shifts what it means to be a citizen or a resident, legal or otherwise, in the United States. So one of the ways that we can look at this shift is by looking at the difference between the blue line in this chart and the red line. And if we zoom in on this, what we see is that the red line looks at removals, and removals really begin to grow after 1996. Now before that, returns were far more common. Now when we think about the difference between returns and removals, it's important to think about what that means for an actual immigrant. Returns are individuals being caught along the US border and returned to typically Mexico. A removal is somebody that is internally caught in the United States and then removed from the United States, right? Oftentimes that has a very deep impact on individuals and their family members. So an individual that is actually removed from the United States has typically been in the United States for a period of time, has established a life, has children, likely lives in a mixed status, immigration status family. And therefore that removal of that person, it affects the family that's left behind, it affects the individual that's removed, and it affects the United States at the end of the day. So if you look at this chart, one of the things that you might assume is that as removals have increased, perhaps the United States has focused more on criminals. After all, this is what we hear in the news, that deportation focuses on the removal of criminal aliens from the United States. But let's look at that a little more closely. If we look at this chart, what we find is the vast majority of people that are removed from the United States are in fact not criminals at all. And even those who are criminals, technically speaking, are individuals that have committed acts that are victimless, the majority of which are simply breaking with immigration laws. And so this helps us understand that drastic shift in legislation in 1996, which made it illegal to enter the United States as an immigrant. Prior to that, it was not a criminal offense to do so. So when we look at this chart, one of the things that we learn is that although 52.3% of people have convictions who are removed by ICE, 60% of those 52%, so 60% of the people that are removed that have criminal convictions are removed for victimless crimes. The majority of those individuals have committed a crime that is quite simple. They crossed into the United States without documentation. That is their only crime. And so when we hear politicians or other individuals in society talking about the importance of removing criminals from the United States, it's important to keep in mind that the majority of people that they're talking about are actually individuals that have committed no crime at all. In fact, the only crime they ever committed was crossing into the United States. So in recent decades, ICE and Homeland Security have deported more people from the United States than in any decades combined in the history of the United States. So deportation has fundamentally shifted. We've created a system of deportation in the United States, and behind it is Homeland Security and ICE. But their tactics have shifted as well. Today, deportation, or the apprehension of immigrants and then the removal of them, one of the main ways in which that work is done is through virtual hunting. Virtual hunting is used to track down details about people's lives, and then those details are used against them in courts of law prior to their deportation. Here is a document obtained from the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, and as you can see, they were able through Facebook to see that this person was a roofer, that he did mechanic work on the side, and they were even able to obtain his parents' residency or address in the United States through Facebook. And so this type of work has allowed for ICE to find more people, track them down, and deport them. Another thing that has shifted since ICE and Homeland Security came on the scene is the access that immigrants have to lawyers. Now, in theory, immigrants should have access to lawyers, but not everyone can hire one. And within the facilities in which detained immigrants are held, so oftentimes private facilities run by organizations like GEO, it's difficult for people to gain access to legal consultation. And so as a result of this, 80% of immigrants are unrepresented through this process. And so now as deportation has grown, the act of apprehension and deportation of undocumented immigrants in the United States has become big business. And so when we look at this process in which people are apprehended and then detained, one of the things that we notice is the majority of people are held in private prison facilities like GEO. GEO facilities are across the United States. They exist in your community, they exist in my community, And they're facilities that are publicly traded. That means that companies like Geo are companies you can invest in. And they're companies that have done quite well over the last 20 years as a result of the growth in deportations from the United States. Now, deportation is big business, and it has also, as a result, led to increases in budget within Congress and Senate. So Congress and Senate have increased the budget available to Border Patrol and ICE agents over the last 20 years. If we look at this from 2003 up to 2019, one of the things we'll notice is ICE's budget has grown as well as Border Patrol's. And so these agencies have become bigger, and the business side of this model has become much larger. On average in the United States today, over 30,000 people are detained. So on any given day in the United States, 30,000 undocumented immigrants are sitting in cells, privately traded company cells, in the United States without access to due process. We can look at this trend here. Now, what this has led to as well is the removal of immigrants to places along the US-Mexico border. And it's created a situation in which cities like Tijuana and cities like Ciudad Juarez and Matamoros in Texas, across the border from Texas, have become cities of deportees, right? When we look at the case of Tijuana, for example, in the early 20th century, Tijuana was a town of 450 people. It was a small rancho, to use the local colloquial word, right? But that rancho has changed into a massive city along the US border with Mexico. So across from San Diego now, there's a city of over 2 million people. And the vast majority of those people have, at one point or another in their life, been in the United States, and many of them are deportees. Okay, so every single week with La Neta, you get a lesson and you get a story. And this week's story is about Enrique Orozco. Enrique Orozco grew up in New York to Colombian parents. He's a US-born citizen. He lived in Georgia for a short period of time before moving to Durango, Colorado. In Durango, Colorado, he became active in protesting against ICE because of ICE's presence within the community. ICE was going to the courthouse, and it was apprehending immigrants as they were coming out of the courthouse after paying simple traffic fines or misdemeanors. And so Enrique and other concerned citizens, including myself, started protesting on the stairs of the courthouse. Now, these protests eventually moved to ICE facilities, which are outside of Durango in the industrial park, in an unmarked building that simply says car wash outside. Those protests led to more media attention, and eventually Enrique became highlighted as one of the antagonists. And so ICE started researching Enrique. I wrote an article about this for the Globe Post, which you can see depicted here on the screen. And in that article, one of the things that I found out was that the Department of Homeland Security did a background check on Enrique. Now, they found out that Enrique had committed a crime in Georgia prior to moving to Durango, and that he was on probation. Enrique had done everything that he needed to stay in good keeping with his probation officer. But he had a run-in Kansas, a misdemeanor. He paid the fine, and he moved on with his life. Now, technically, that misdemeanor, which was about a $100 fine, was a violation of his parole. But it was in a small county. It wasn't something that was going to affect his life. And so he simply went on, right? He paid his fine and then went on with life. But because of his protest, because of his presence in front of ICE facilities, the Department of Homeland Security decided to look into Enrique. When they found that misdemeanor, they sent it to Georgia so that the judge would see it. When the judge saw it, it was technically a violation of his parole, and so they issued a warrant for his arrest. As a result of that, Enrique, on May 5th of 2019, was arrested at a soccer field at Fort Lewis College. When he was apprehended, it was understood that ICE and Homeland Security had worked together to help make that take place. Now, I looked into this further because I was interested in understanding how an individual who had participated in protests like the one that you see here had become such a concern for ICE and Homeland Security. I contacted ICE, and after several conversations on the phone, I eventually received an email that simply said, and I quote, "ICE doesn't discuss investigative methods, tactics, techniques, or procedures," end quote. And this, I think, is important. This case of Enrique is a story that has happened across the United States, where people who have protested or activists who have stood up against ICE and the Department of Homeland Security have either been apprehended, and or pressured to stop doing their activism work. And that is un-American. That cannot be stood for. And when we look at ICE, what we see, based on these types of responses, is an organization that has a deep impact within our communities, but that we have no way of holding accountable. And so ICE and the Department of Homeland Security are institutions that cannot be held accountable by everyday citizens. And so ICE and Homeland Security operate within our communities, but they operate above us. We have no way of holding them accountable for their actions within our communities. And this is a point that was actually made by Russ Feingold when the Homeland Security Act of 2002 was passed. Now, according to Russ, when Homeland Security Act in 2002 was passed, George W. Bush said, "This landmark legislation, the most extensive since the 1940s, will help our nation meet the emerging threats of terrorism in the 21st century." But 9 out of 100 senators voted against the Act of Homeland Security. Only 9. 1 independent and 8 Democrats. One of those Democrats was Russ Feingold out of Wisconsin. And he said that the act will undermine, and I quote, "It'll undermine protections against unwarranted government intrusion into the lives of ordinary Americans." Ordinary American citizens like Enrique Orozco, like myself, like you, like anybody else who chooses to stand up against the intrusive acts of ICE and Homeland Security within our communities. And so this was a fear among those who voted against the Department of Homeland Security's founding in 2002, and it is a reality today. All right, so as you know, La Neta is about breaking down truths. And La Neta this week is that mass deportation in the United States is a threat to civil rights everywhere in the United States. As we watch millions of people to be deported from this country, we have to keep in mind that those individuals are Americans in residency. They are tied to American families. They are tied to U.S. citizens. They work alongside us. They study alongside us. They grew up alongside us. They are our neighbors. They are our community members. And they are individuals who deserve due process and dignity. As I think about this, I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King, who in 1963 wrote the following from Birmingham jail. I quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And that is La Neta this week. The mass deportation of undocumented immigrants from the United States is directly affecting American families, and it is indirectly affecting all of us. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.